Detective David Holden had worked homicide for 23 years, but missing persons cases always left a different kind of ache. When the call came about a night delivery driver named Marco who had vanished 3 weeks ago, Holden almost ignored it. The file landed on his desk because someone from the precinct's community outreach had insisted. Marco had no family that anyone could find, no social media presence, no friends who filed a report. A landlord wanted his apartment back. That was the only reason the case was still open. Holden flipped through the thin folder. One audio file. 12 seconds. He pressed play. Heavy footsteps echoed first, then a metallic door creaking open, then the steady drip of water. No voices, no screams, no music. Just those 3 sounds repeating in his head. He played it 5 times. The footsteps were not running. They were calm. The person walking knew where they were going. The door sounded old, the kind of hinge that never gets oiled. The water drip had a rhythm, 1 drop per second. Holden closed his eyes and imagined basements, tunnels, abandoned maintenance rooms. He decided to start with city maps, not digital but paper. He spread them across his desk and began looking for places where underground water lines crossed with old railway tunnels. The first 3 hours gave him nothing. Then he noticed something strange. In the past 2 years, 4 other delivery drivers had disappeared from the same district. All of them worked night shifts. All had no relatives listed. All were erased from public records as if they never existed. Holden drove to the last known location of Marco's scooter. The tracking data placed it outside a shuttered textile factory on Mercer Street. The building had been sold 3 times in 5 years, always to shell companies. He parked half a block away and walked. The neighborhood was gray and lifeless, with broken streetlights and walls covered in old posters for bands that no longer played. The factory's loading dock had fresh tire marks, not from a delivery scooter but from van tires, wide and heavy. He took photos. The main entrance was chained, but a side door hung slightly open. Holden pushed it with his flashlight. Inside, the air smelled of rust and cold concrete. The floor was too clean, no dust or debris, only a single path leading to a metal door at the far end. He touched the door. The hinge was new, but the frame was old. Someone had replaced only the hinge. He pulled out his phone and recorded the sound of opening it. The creak matched the audio exactly. Beyond the door, stairs went down into darkness. The water drip started immediately. He counted 32 steps down, then a corridor with unpainted brick walls but a swept floor. He followed the drip for 50 meters until he reached a small room with a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the middle stood a single chair bolted to the floor. No chains, no blood, no tools. On the wall behind it, a calendar. Each day of the past 2 years had a check mark. For missing persons, 4 check marks on specific dates. Marco's disappearance date had a check. Holden realized this was not a random crime scene. It was a system. He called for backup but stayed in the room, examining every inch. The calendar was ordinary, the kind given away by hardware stores. No handwriting except the check marks. No fingerprints visible. The chair had scuff marks on the legs, suggesting it had been moved and rebolted more than once. Holden knelt and looked under the seat. A small piece of duct tape held a folded note. He used tweezers to remove it. The note read, 112 steps east, then listen. He left the room and walked east through the corridor. Exactly 112 steps later, he reached a dead end. but the wall had a small hole at knee level. He knelt and listened. On the other side came faint voices in a language he could not identify, then hammering, then a man coughing. Holden pressed record on his phone. The voices continued for 2 minutes, then stopped. Heavy footsteps walked away, the same heavy footsteps from the audio file. Holden backed away quietly and returned to the surface. Backup arrived 15 minutes later. They found a hidden door behind a movable section of brick. Beyond it, a large underground chamber converted into living quarters with 6 cots, 6 sets of clothes, and 6 empty water bottles. But no people. The occupants had been moved within the last hour. Tools were scattered around, jackhammers, welding equipment, rolls of industrial cable. Someone was using missing people for construction work, probably illegal renovations. Holden noticed a van could drive directly into a connected tunnel leading to a service ramp. The ramp opened onto a street with no cameras. Whoever ran this operation knew the city's blind spots better than the police did. Back at the precinct, Holden pulled records of every reported missing person in the last 5 years who fit the same profile: no family, no steady job, no digital footprint. He found 23 names. Only 7 had active files. The rest had been closed as left voluntarily. He cross-referenced their last known locations with properties that had changed ownership through the same shell companies. The factory on Mercer Street was one. There were 3 others: an old parking garage, a closed school, and a warehouse near the river. Each property had recent permits for structural assessment, all signed by the same engineering firm that existed only on paper. Holden drove to the warehouse first. It was near the river, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A security camera pointed at the gate. He stayed in his car and watched. At 2 in the morning, a white van with no plates arrived. The driver got out, walked to a keypad, entered a code, and the gate opened. The van drove inside. The gate closed. Holden could not see the driver's face. He waited. 40 minutes later, the van left. This time, he followed at a distance. The van drove 20 minutes to an industrial park, entered a loading bay, and the lights went out. Holden noted the address. The next morning, he ran the property owner. Another shell company. But this time, the chain led to a name: Paul Shaw. A real estate developer with no criminal record, no social media, and a reputation for buying neglected properties at low prices and selling them months later for triple the value. The renovations were always done quickly, quietly, and without city inspections. Holden dug into Shaw's history. Paul Shaw was 48 years old, born in a different city, moved here 12 years ago. He owned 15 properties through various LLCs. Every property he sold had been renovated using contractors who were never licensed. The city had tried to inspect 3 of his sites, but each time the building was sealed and no one answered the door. By the time inspectors got a warrant, the work was done and the workers were gone. Holden requested Shaw's financial records, but that would take days. He did not have days. One of the missing persons, a woman named Elena, had last been seen near the old parking garage on Wilson Avenue. Holden went there alone. The garage was 6 stories of crumbling concrete. The first floor had a working elevator. He took it to the basement. The basement was dark except for a single exit sign. He followed the sign to a door that required a key card. His police credential did not work, but a bump key from his kit opened the lock after 20 seconds. Behind the door, a long hallway with exposed pipes. The water drip returned. Then voices, louder now. A man said something about finishing basement walls tomorrow and moving to the next site. Another tired voice asked how many more weeks. The first replied that Shaw said 6, then they would be free. Holden recorded everything. He crept closer. At the end of the hallway, 3 men in work clothes were mixing cement. They looked thin and pale with dark circles under their eyes. No chains, no guards, no weapons. One man tried to walk toward the exit, but the others stopped him, saying that Shaw would find him, that Shaw always finds them. Holden realized the control was purely psychological. Shaw made them believe escape was impossible. Holden did not call for backup yet. He knew a raid would scatter the workers and Shaw would vanish. He needed Shaw in custody, so he waited. He spent the next 3 nights watching the warehouse near the river. On the 4th night, the white van arrived again. This time the driver got out and walked to a different door. The security camera had a blind spot behind a dumpster, and Holden moved into that spot. The driver removed his hood. It was Paul Shaw, medium height, gray hair, plain face, looking like any other businessman. Shaw entered the warehouse. Holden followed after 30 seconds. Inside, the warehouse had been divided into small rooms, each with a cot and a bucket, no windows, stale air. Shaw walked to the last room and spoke to someone inside in a calm, almost friendly tone. Then he turned and walked back. Holden hid behind a stack of pallets as Shaw passed within 2 meters. After Shaw left, Holden checked the room. A man sat on the cot staring at the wall, unresponsive. When Holden asked his name, the man blinked slowly and said Marco. He was the delivery driver, alive but thin and dehydrated. Holden identified himself as a police officer, but Marco shook his head. He said Shaw had warned him that a detective would come, and that if Marco talked, his sister would die. Marco did not know his sister's address. Shaw had shown him a photo and said she was being watched. That was the leash. Even the invisible ones had someone, a distant cousin, an elderly parent, an ex-partner. Shaw found that person and made a quiet threat, stay and work, or they disappear. Holden felt cold anger. This was not greed. It was control for its own sake. Holden pulled back and created a plan. He could not raid all 4 sites at once. He needed Shaw to lead him to a central location where records were kept. Every operation like this had a book or a hard drive. He reviewed Shaw's property purchases again. One stood out, a small office building on Elm Street that Shaw had bought 3 years ago and never sold. It had no permits for renovation and no activity, but property taxes were paid on time. Holden drove past it. The building was 4 stories of brick with boarded windows, no security cameras, no lights, but the lock on the front door was new. His bump key opened it. Inside, the first floor was empty and dusty with no footprints. But the elevator showed recent use, with wear on the basement button. He took the stairs down. The basement was not abandoned. It was an office with clean desks, computers, filing cabinets, and a whiteboard on the wall listing 23 names. Beside each name, a location, a health status, and an exit date. Most exit dates were blank. 4 had dates. Those 4 had died. Holden read the notes: 1 heart attack, 1 fall from scaffolding, 2 removed for trying to escape. No bodies had ever been found. Shaw had his own disposal method. Holden photographed everything. Then he heard the elevator move. He turned off his flashlight and hid behind a filing cabinet. The elevator door opened. Shaw stepped out alone. He walked to the whiteboard, erased one name, wrote another, then sat at a desk and opened a laptop. Holden could see the screen, lists of names, addresses, photos of family members. This was the command center. Holden had his evidence. He texted for backup, but Shaw looked up and stared directly at the filing cabinet, saying that he had been expecting Holden for 3 days. Holden stood. His hand rested on his service weapon, but he did not draw. Shaw smiled a thin, practiced smile and commented that Holden was smart for finding the calendar note, following the drip, and waiting. Most would not have waited. Holden asked how Shaw knew his name. Shaw turned the laptop screen to show a file on David Holden, date of birth, address, ex-wife's name, daughter's school. Shaw explained that he knew everyone who might come looking. He had known when Holden pulled the missing persons files and when he visited the factory. Shaw had let him find the room with the chair and wanted him to see the calendar. The check marks were for Holden. When asked why, Shaw said the system was broken. The city approved renovations without inspecting who did the work. Developers paid millions, but no one cared about the workers. Shaw claimed he gave them housing and purpose, taking a percentage of the project value. He said the dead were accidents. Holden pointed out that Shaw threatened their families. Shaw shrugged and said fear was efficient, adding that he had learned that from Holden. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old newspaper clipping with the headline about Detective Holden's unorthodox interrogation leading to a confession, 20 years old. Holden had arrested a human trafficker by threatening to deport the man's son, which was neither legal nor ethical, but it worked. Shaw said he read that article in law school before dropping out, and never forgot that the right threat could replace any lock. He thanked Holden for the lesson. Holden felt the weight of those words. 20 years ago he had crossed a line to close a case, telling himself it was justified. Now he saw the reflection. But guilt would not save the people underground. He asked what happened now. Shaw closed the laptop and said Holden had a choice. He could arrest Shaw, but if he did, files on every threat would go to a lawyer and then to the families. The moment Shaw was in custody, those threats would become real. People would die, including Holden's own people. Holden knew Shaw was not bluffing. The man had planned for capture. The other choice was to walk away. Shaw would finish his current project, sell the properties, retire, and let the workers go free. No one else would die. Shaw would disappear, and Holden would become the hero who solved the missing persons cases by finding them alive. Holden looked at the whiteboard, 23 names, 4 dead, 19 still alive including Marco. Arresting Shaw now would put families in danger. Letting him go would allow him to exploit another city. Holden asked for proof that the threats were real. Shaw handed him a phone showing a live video feed of a woman sitting in a parked car outside a house. It was Holden's ex-wife's house. Shaw said she was fine, but the man watching her had a needle with something that would put her to sleep for 12 hours, then leave. No crime, no evidence, but Holden would spend those 12 hours not knowing if she was dead or alive. Psychological, just like Holden had taught him. Holden's jaw tightened. Holden took a breath and made a decision Shaw did not expect. He sat down on the floor, not in defeat but in patience. He said he could not arrest Shaw without risking innocent people, but he also could not let him walk away, so he would wait. Shaw frowned and asked what he was waiting for. Holden replied that Shaw was controlling 23 threats across the city, which took constant attention. Eventually someone would fail to check in, or a camera would malfunction, or a watcher would get tired. When that happened, Holden would have his opening. Shaw laughed shortly and asked if Holden would wait days or weeks. Holden nodded, saying he had waited 20 years to understand what he had created, so he could wait a little longer. Then Holden did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone and placed it on the floor between them, announcing that he was recording the conversation. Shaw was confessing to everything. If anything happened to Holden, the recording would go to the FBI, the press, and every news station. Shaw would never work in any city again. Shaw's smile faded. He reached for the phone, but Holden was faster, grabbing it and standing. Holden said Shaw could not hurt him because if he did, he would lose his retirement plan, his anonymity, and become famous for the wrong reasons. For the first time, Shaw looked uncertain. The psychological game had flipped. Holden was no longer the student but the teacher again, this time teaching a lesson in consequences. Shaw stared at Holden for a long minute. Then he picked up his laptop and walked to the elevator, saying Holden had 24 hours. After that, he would activate the contingencies. The workers would be moved, the families contacted, and Holden would never find him again. The elevator door closed. Holden did not follow. He had the recording and the whiteboard photos, but not the watchers' identities. He called his captain and explained everything. The captain wanted to send a tactical team, but Holden refused, saying a raid would trigger the threats. Instead, he asked for every available officer to quietly visit the homes of the missing person's relatives, not to arrest but just to be seen, to stand outside, to let Shaw's watchers know the police were present. The captain agreed. Within 2 hours, officers were stationed near 22 addresses. The 23rd address was Holden's ex-wife's house. He went there himself. He parked across the street and watched the parked car that Shaw had shown him on the video feed. The car had a driver. Holden walked over and knocked on the window. The young driver looked terrified. Holden told him he was being paid to watch the house, that it ended now. He ordered him to leave the city tonight, warning that if he stayed, Holden would find him using his license plate, his face, and his employer's confession. The young man drove away without a word. Holden called his ex-wife, who was confused but safe. One threat neutralized. Over the next 12 hours, the same scene repeated across the city. Officers reported that most watchers left without resistance. They were not hardened criminals but desperate people hired for cheap. A few stayed and were arrested on minor charges to keep them off the streets. By hour 18 of the 23 families were no longer being watched. The remaining 5 required more careful handling. Holden personally visited each family member and explained the situation. Some were angry, some scared, but all agreed to go to safe locations provided by the department. By hour 22, every threat was neutralized. Shaw's network had collapsed. But Shaw himself was gone. His office basement was empty. His properties were abandoned. The workers, including Marco, were found in the warehouse near the river. They were dehydrated and exhausted but alive. Holden interviewed Marco for 2 hours. Marco described the work, renovating underground spaces for wealthy clients who wanted hidden rooms, secret passages, off-the-record basements. Shaw charged premium prices and paid the workers nothing except food and the safety of their families. It was modern slavery with a spreadsheet. Holden filed charges against Shaw, kidnapping, false imprisonment, extortion, and 4 counts of manslaughter. But Shaw was not in the city. His passport had been used to leave the country 12 hours before the threats were neutralized. He had a head start. Holden knew Shaw would surface again somewhere else. that knowledge was bitter. But he also knew he had saved 19 people. That was not nothing. 3 months later, Holden received a postcard with no return address. The front showed a generic beach, the kind sold in tourist shops. The back had 2 words written in neat handwriting, "See you." Holden turned the postcard over and over. No fingerprints, no DNA. The postmark was from a country that did not extradite. He put the postcard in a drawer with the old newspaper clipping from 20 years ago. He was not the same man who had made that threat. He had learned that shortcuts create monsters. But he had also learned that patience, honesty, and a quiet refusal to compromise could undo some of the damage. The missing persons cases were closed. 19 people went home. 4 families received closure. The city passed a new law requiring licensed contractors for all underground renovations. Holden still worked homicide. He still took the cases no one else wanted. But he no longer used fear as a weapon. He used facts and patience. And he waited. Because Paul Shaw was out there somewhere, probably starting again. And when Shaw made his next mistake, David Holden would be ready, not for revenge but for justice, the kind that does not need threats, the kind that lasts. The final image was Holden sitting at his desk, the postcard in the drawer, his eyes on a new missing persons file. The drip of a leaky faucet echoed softly from the precinct hallway. He did not flinch. He had heard worse, and he had learned that every sound tells a story.